Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guest for the third consecutive week is retired educator Dan Mahala. Last week, Dan and I began a discussion of one of the most famous, thought-provoking essays ever written by an American. I'm referring to an essay entitled Self-Reliance by the great American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. In this essay, Emerson gives us some advice about some of the things he believed we could all do to live more fulfilling lives. Dan, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do is to just in a minute or less, hopefully, summarize some of the points Dan and I have already made. Last week, we talked about some of the main themes of the essay. Emerson advises us to trust ourselves. In fact, his own words, trust thyself. He says that we should trust our own judgment more than that of society. He says we should cultivate our individuality. We should cultivate our uniqueness. And that we should not live for the approval of other people. Indeed, a sentence from Self-Reliance. He says, "My life is for itself and not for a spectacle." In this program, Dan and I will further probe the main ideas of the essay, Self-Reliance, and also examine some criticisms of Emerson's ideas. Dan, do you want to add anything to what you said last week?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things we didn't get to cover, as usual.
Yeah.
But I think there's a total misinterpretation of a lot of things that Emerson has said. And people who have briefly looked at his essay on self-reliance say that, oh, this guy's, this is impossible. We can't all do this. We can't all obtain greatness by looking within. And besides, Emerson was a guy that had no heart. He was cold. And I'd like to try to dispute that a little bit, at least say something in his favor. I mean, he made the comment, regret, sympathy, and prayers are a disease of the will. And that's pretty shocking to people, when you read something like that. But
he's been accused, I'm going to go right back to you in a second, but for those viewers who don't understand perhaps what we're talking about, one of the criticisms of Emerson is that he overdid the individualism thing, that he is encouraging us to be individuals. He's encouraging us to cultivate our uniqueness, and this could result in self-absorption.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that a little bit later.
Okay.
I'd like to compare the rugged individualism that Emerson talked about with today's, what we call extreme individualism. They're far from the same thing. But Emerson felt that everybody was capable of helping themselves, that everybody could go within and find those powers that are God-given or whatever to advance themselves, to bring themselves forward, to solve their problems and so forth. Now, he was kind of cold when it came to helping poor by giving sympathy, by prayer and so forth. He kind of spoke this down, although he was a minister. He thought that turning outward was not the proper way. But you have to remember the context, the historical context. 19th century liberalism, of which had overshadowed the 19th century, its politics, its philosophy, and everything else, said exactly this, that if you try to help the weak and the unproductive, you're going to destroy them. It came from original Puritanism, that everybody had within them those capabilities, and don't try to destroy them. Today you might say it can be compared to if you're working with a drug addict. I mean, the one thing you can do, you can give them the drug they crave, but you're not helping that individual. You want them to get rid of that habit.
So what you're saying is that Emerson was not lacking passion.
Not at all.
What he wanted to do was to encourage people to cultivate inner strength.
Yeah, lacking compassion, as you mentioned last week, he was one of the leading abolitionists. I mean, he was a very compassionate person, but he didn't want to destroy that inner power that each and every person possesses, or he felt that each and every person possessed. And he didn't want to play that down, destroy it. He wanted to encourage it, to bring it out.
I think to put in perspective what you're saying, we have to understand that Emerson did believe life is difficult.
Oh, yeah.
And that if we're going to navigate the bumps in life, in his opinion,
Yeah.
it was extremely important that we cultivate a certain inner strength. But as you said, he showed compassion in advocating the abolition of slavery. He was for women's rights. He was a proponent of civil rights in general.
Yeah.
Let me get to another specific question here, Dan, that I hope we can spend quite a bit of time on. The question is this. First, the question, then a couple of brief comments from Emerson concerning it, and then I'll go to you for your ideas. How does a greater self-reliance affect our lives? Emerson said this: with the exercise of self-trust, new powers shall appear. He also went on to say, it is easy to see that a greater self-reliance must work a revolution in all the relations of men. And then he went on to say this, that if we become more self-reliant, it's going to affect how we see religion, education, daily modes of living, our speculative views. That again, if we become more self-reliant, it's going to have a very pervasive effect on how we live. Now, Dan, do you want to pick up on one of those categories? You pick one: religion, education, modes of living.
Yeah, on education, he felt that our education, or the education that existed during his period of time, which he didn't think too much of, incidentally, and he was a Harvard graduate, was definitely lacking because people were misdirected. So if we focused on self-reliance, we could go for our education pretty much within. And he had I picked out a little chronology on education, and he starts off talking about infants. And, you know, an infant conforms to nobody, knows how to make do without anybody else. They play, they perform for themselves and and this is total nonconformity, total reliance on the inner self.
Spontaneity.
Yeah. And then he says, then we become boys. Now, boys are nonchalant, independent, irresponsible, and judge other people on their merit, as long as they're not overly influenced by outside society. And as far as education goes, we all know, you and I both in education, that the first 4 years in grammar school, kids are extremely curious the first 2 years. They want to learn everything. They're open to everything, and they work at it and so forth. But after 4 or 5 years, unfortunately, we almost discourage this. I mean, we kind of force upon them what we think they should learn, and they lose a lot of that powerful initiative that they go in with.
Yeah.
Anyway, we get to manhood, and he says, man is clapped into a jail by his consciousness and affected by sympathy and hatred of others. So there, we've lost all this childlikeness, and we become men, but society has made us so conscious of other people influencing us by this hatreds and sympathies and whatnot, that we don't do anything, that we don't go in, we don't rely on ourselves, we rely totally on the exterior.
In fact, Emerson said in a quote from Self-Reliance, he said that society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Again, we must realize that Emerson believed that the majority is usually wrong. He believed in democracy, by the way.
Yeah.
That sounds like a contradiction, but he did believe in democracy, but at the same time believed that in everyday matters, the majority is usually wrong.
Yeah, and you know, right after the quotation you just said, he also said society considers conformity a virtue. I mean, we're civilized and refined when we conform with the rest of our society, which is the opposite of self-reliance. Society considers self-reliance an aversion, something you got to stay away from for some reason or another. And I think the reason Emerson put so much emphasis on mankind working within himself, finding solutions to his problem, finding the guide to it, because he felt that was the natural way. And one of his quotations was, "We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. Within us, this is within us, we lie in a lap of immense intelligence, and let's get at it, let's use it. Yeah. And that was Emerson's total idea about education.
Interesting what you say. Some people tend to believe, I think, that education consists metaphorically of filling a vessel.
Yeah.
Whereas other people have said, in fact, the poet Yeats, Butler Yeats said that, no, education consists of lighting a fire.
Yes.
So that the good teacher is not habitually pouring information into the student's head, although that's part of teaching. Rather, the good teacher is trying to find out what's inside the student and get that student to express what is inside of him, knowing that the student has a certain intuitive wisdom.
Yeah.
Of course, there's foolishness in all of us as well, but there's also some wisdom in all of us.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, you were talking about conformity. Emerson said that society whips us with its displeasure for our conformity. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that society often reacts negatively to the nonconformist?
Well, mainly for control. The nonconformist scares people, I think. You know, if you don't have them controlled properly, a government has to control the head of a corporation, the principal of the school, the teacher have to control. So the nonconformist is a little bit scary to people in authority because they can't control that person. And Emerson wanted absolutely no control. He felt that the ease at which we accept outside influences is harming to the individual. So his education should be not from the outside, from the inside.
Let's go with that. I think if Emerson were here today, he would say that one of the reasons society can have harmful influences on people, and of course society can have positive influences also, but society can often influence people in negative ways. Historically, for example, if we think about how American society has influenced black people for over 200 years, American society was conditioning black people to feel inferior to white people. The same thing could be said of women. We know women didn't get the right to vote in the United States until 1920. I mean, I've mentioned many times on this program, no woman ever voted for George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or William McKinley or Theodore Roosevelt. No women ever voted. They couldn't vote.
Yeah.
And how many women, again, were conditioned to believe that they weren't intelligent enough to vote. And we know that the first feminists, if I can use that term, Susan B. Anthony, for example, people like her, were ridiculed. When they began a campaign for civil rights, they were ridiculed. And I would argue that just as blacks and women in American history, and not just in America, by the way, in so many areas of the world, these groups have been conditioned to feel inferior. I would also argue that in so many societies today, homosexuals are conditioned to feel badly about themselves. My understanding is the rate of suicide among gay teenage boys is much higher than among any other group. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's true. And one wonders, is that a result of society's conditioning? One final comment, because I know you want to say something on this. I myself never use the word fag. I don't like that word at all. But it's interesting that gay people will be called fags, but a dishonest businessman will never be called a fag. Kids who cheat in school will never be called fags. Bullies in school will never, and that word fag can really, I assume, have a tremendous impact on somebody who's the victim of that word.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting that in society it seems worse to be a homosexual, traditionally anyway, I think it's changing, than to be dishonest, than to be a bully, etc. Any comments on this?
Yeah, you talk about society and how it influences mankind. In the 20th century, I think, we found a more greater need for self-reliance than during Emerson's time, and maybe even greater today. The government and authorities really learned to use propaganda, really learned to use the power of influence in society. America started during World War I. We had to influence our public to support the war effort and so forth, and did the same thing in World War II, and found out, hey, it works pretty well. We can influence the public to do a lot of things, and we know how the previous administration influenced people to reinterpret patriotism and other things like that. So I think it's so much more important today that we look at all forms of authority, be it government, corporations, whatever.
Advertising industry.
Advertising industry, PR industry, all of these things, and say, maybe that's not what I should be believing. Maybe there's another source, and that source, as Emerson says, is within us.
I've mentioned several times in past conversations that George Stern, who teaches at the College of Staten Island, has an expression I love. He uses the expression designated thinker. That so many people, he says, don't think for themselves.
Yeah.
They have a designated thinker. It could be Derek Jeter doing a commercial for some car, and maybe Derek persuading somebody to buy that car because Derek Jeter says it's a good car. Or it could be a Republican politician or a Democratic politician propagandizing people. So they become the designated thinkers. The idea is, I'm not good enough at thinking, so I must rely on some celebrity or the advertising industry or some politician to tell me what I should think.
Yeah, well, that's the stage we've reached today. And, we all complain about, our society and our young people. We all complain about teenagers, they don't know anything, so forth and so on. But the fact is that we don't do a lot of thinking on our own today, especially our youth. It's almost impossible for them to fight against the conformity that's forced upon them. And I say forced upon them because every means of entertainment, music, acting, TV shows, everything else forces them into a compartment that you behave like this or else you're not going to be accepted.
Yeah.
You want the girls to like you, you want to do this, you got to behave, you got to dress like this, you got to watch the TV shows that are on the...
I'll tell you what is so interesting about what you're saying. A couple of weeks ago, I was babysitting for my grandnieces. One is 10 and one is 8. They are both delightful children, in my opinion. I really enjoy babysitting for them. They come to my house, by the way, when I babysit for them. But I allow them to watch an hour and a half of television when they come, and I let them choose what they want to watch. And I think it's the Disney Channel, I'm not sure, but it is a channel that caters, it's a cable channel that caters to children. And I noticed in the program they were watching that it seemed to me, the program, intentionally or unintentionally, it was about children and young teenagers, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids. The program, at least unintentionally, was promoting an image that girls should try to be cute, maybe even a little sexy, and boys should try to be cute. And I was thinking, when my grandnieces watch this program, they may not realize there are many ways to be a person. There are many ways to be a preteen. There are many ways to be a teenager. There's not one way. But I think it's fair to say, generally, television and advertising only portray one or two ways to be a person.
Yeah, to make, today, all people are under tremendous influence by the entertainment society. And it's just that they pick and choose what they want people. They want young women to be sexy, they want young men to be manly, and they choose how to satisfy those goals and how the people should behave. And this is what demands a reopening of Emerson's self-reliance.
Interesting you mentioned manliness, because I think it is true that society conditions, or at least attempts to, maybe even unintentionally, how we look upon what it means to be manly. And I suspect many boys and men have the idea that among the things being manly involves is being interested in sports, maybe drinking beer, maybe taking karate lessons or whatever, and dressing a certain way. That if one were to tell a young boy or a man that the essence of manliness, this is just an opinion, is being a person of integrity, that being manly has nothing to do with whether you're a good baseball player. It has nothing to do with whether you're physically fit. It has nothing to do with drinking beer. It has to do with how honest you are, which means that the nerdy boy who's 14 years old and can't play sports, he has 2 left feet, but never cheats on tests in school, is a very kind person, does volunteer work after school, could be more manly than the quarterback of the football team, who may cheat on tests, who may bully girls. I'm not suggesting that most high school quarterbacks do this, but I think you get the point. I think the audience gets. So even young boys are really being confused. And I wonder if the clergy is doing enough to explain to boys what it really means to be manly. There's nothing to do with sports or drinking beer. In fact, one final point, and I want to go to you. I'm sorry I'm talking too much.
No, it's all right.
I remember, maybe 10 years ago, I stopped watching the Super Bowl. And I was with my father on a Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday.
Yeah.
And the Super Bowl was about to come on. And I said, I'm going into another room. And he said, what are you guys going to read? And my father said to me, you're not going to watch the Super Bowl? I said, no. He said, well, when you go to school tomorrow, all the other guys are going to be talking about the Super Bowl. You know, won't you feel left out? I thought this very revealing comment about my father, that, you know, you have to, if you're a man, a real man, you know, am I going to tell the other guys I didn't watch the Super Bowl? Is there something wrong with you, Phil? You didn't watch the Super Bowl?
You know, what you just said about manliness and so forth was probably the best thing said since Emerson himself made the statement, which I have here, whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist.
Yeah.
I mean, I think every teacher from high school and college should have on the board Monday morning or the next class that meets that expression and ask the students, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. What does it mean to the girl sitting there in the front row and the guys sitting here and so forth? And open a discussion on that. And I don't know if it's going to change the world, but it would certainly change people's thinking about being a nonconformist and being a maybe eccentric, you know, doing things other than what everybody else is doing.
You know, a while back I was talking about how society can negatively influence people, and how it has probably, in times past, negatively influenced women, blacks, and gays. It still is to a certain extent today. But also, if we look at how contemporary society, perhaps not just in the United States, but maybe in other advanced countries, is conditioning people. It seems to me, I'd like feedback from you, that people are conditioned about what they believe to be the good life. That if you watch a lot of television, movies, listen to contemporary music, I think one might get the impression the good life involves acquiring a lot of social status and a lot of goods. It's basically consumerism. And also having a certain image. I'm sophisticated, I'm sexy, I'm intellectual. Has nothing to do with cultivating your individuality. It has nothing to do with cultivating virtue. That it's all about buying things, having a certain image, and being able to impress other people. Emerson on the subject again of impressing other people, recall at the top of the program, and I love this quote from him. He said, "My life is for itself and not for a spectacle." I'm not living to impress other people. I'm not living to get their approval. I'm living to cultivate my conscience, my soul, and my intellect. That's why I'm living.
You mentioned individualism, and from Emerson's time to present time, individualism, the term itself has changed its meaning 180 degrees, I think. Emerson talked about rugged individualist. Now this, to him, this stems from Puritanism, from dissent against authority. That's the rugged individual, stands on his own 2 feet, doesn't have to accept what authority teaches them. And it was also a desire to find oneself and to express oneself. That was the self-reliance that he talks about. I have a couple other things here.
Yeah, go ahead.
He rejected all absolute authority. Rugged individualism meant making sacrifices. Rugged because they didn't take the easy way. And it usually concerned not with prestige and possessions, but getting one's ideas across and so forth. Today, the individualism or the excessive individualism or extreme individualism that we talked about, they're absorbed with themselves. And it's all into self-absorption. How can I power and influence other people? It's not about individualism, standing on your own 2 feet, doing the things on your own, but it focuses on benefiting oneself. The the very expression greed is good, if one can accept that, then one isn't a rugged individualist at all. One is very selfish
Yeah.
and self-absorbed.
Apropos, I think, of what you're saying, Emerson talked about how the majority usually evaluates other people. And I want to quote him. Emerson said, people measure their esteem of each other by what each has, not by what each is.
Yeah.
Again, measuring other people by their possessions and not by what the person is in terms of virtue, for example. Reminds me of Seneca. Seneca said that when one visits our home or apartment, the person should not admire our furniture. The person should admire us in terms of our integrity, our kindness, etc. That's what really counts, not our furnishings. And I wonder how often this is true among people. I suspect it is true that in many societies, not just America, people are conditioned to judge other people by their possessions and social status.
Yeah, unfortunately, and back to Emerson, that is not the rugged individualist that came from Europe because they wouldn't accept the authority of the church and government there, and went west on their own to stand on their own 2 feet so they could express themselves, so they could know themselves and express themselves. That's what rugged individualism is. Today, individualism, not a good thing.
Yeah, interesting that what you're saying, and I know you're on target, that for Emerson, being a rugged individualist, among many things, and this is extremely important in his thinking, meant being a dissenter. Yeah. That if you believe slavery was wrong, if you believe that not allowing women to vote was wrong, if you believe the Mexican War was wrong, you speak out, knowing that certain people are going to come down hard on you. Yeah. That if you're a dissenter, even in democracies, that sounds strange, doesn't it? But it's true. Some people say especially in democracies. If you are a dissenter and you represent a minority viewpoint, well, it's likely that you're going to suffer the displeasure of many people. We only have a few seconds. Any other comments? We have like 10 seconds left. Any other comments?
Study Emerson, especially his essay on self-reliance.
Okay.
It'll help everybody.
Dan, I thank you very much for these segments on Emerson. As is my custom, I'd like to conclude the program with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, wrote the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."